Thanks to Zach and everyone else who helped to organize today's event. It's very useful for us to be able to exchange with you here. You're in a different part of the continent, but we're sharing many of the same issues, and so I look forward to a informative exchange between us. As Zach said, I'm a member of the Vancouver Eco-Socialist Group. We formed last year for two reasons. Number one, we're in British Columbia, and so like you here, we're on a coast, and therefore we're under assault by the expansion ambitions of the fossil fuel industry. And then we also felt there was a particular need for the Vancouver Eco-Socialist Group and the System Change Climate Change Network to bring our particular view and outlook to the growing environmental movement that's concerned about the fate of the earth, the fate of where the corporate juggernaut is taking us. I'll talk about that a little later in the talk today about the unique and we think important view and outlook that we bring to the climate change movement. I'm a lifetime socialist. I've been a factory worker all my life, a union member, a political activist. My last job before I finished working, don't like to use the word retirement, was as an aircraft mechanic in Vancouver, British Columbia. I've lived there for the past 15 years, and before that lived across the country. Spent a lot of that time with my wife, Monica, who's here with us today. Hi, Monica. And I've been a writer as well for much of my life, and it's, you know, I've part of what I learned in university was a certain capacity to be able to communicate by the written word, and so I've done a lot of writing during my life, and in particular I would say over the past 5 years about climate change issues, whether it's fossil fuels, what's happening with our forests, with the fisheries and the oceans. You know, they're all part of this assault and degradation on our natural environment that's going on at the hands of the corporate juggernaut. And so that's really what's, I think, driven my desire to learn more about why we're having such difficulties with the world today, with our environment, with the unrelenting assault by the different capitalist industries against our life, our planet, our expectations for the future. And so it's the writing has really been a driving force for learning more, because if you're going to write intelligently, you got to research and find out what you're talking about, and hopefully it'll prove useful to others. So all around for me, it's been a good experience. I haven't had a book published yet, although if I were to spend some time, there's certainly a couple of very specific issues, such as oil by rail, that would be, I think, very helpful for me to think about. Now, as I said, I've been a lifetime socialist, so it's those of us who were active politically in the 1960s and 70s. I'm of the generation of the early 70s, shall we say, but I'm old enough to have taken part in protests against the war in Vietnam. We weren't unaware of the importance of environmental politics 40 years ago. There were lots of things going on in the world even at that time telling us that this capitalist system that we have internationally was increasingly harmful to the environment. So we fought against the industrial pollution that was going on at the time, and we keep learning more and more about the scale of that. When I was in San Francisco just recently, there's huge areas of the San Francisco Bay Area that have been polluted by industries in the past and are only now beginning to be addressed. In cities, we fought against the expansion of expressways because we knew how damaging it was to subordinate the planning and development of urban areas to the automobile. There were terrific battles against nuclear waste. So all of that went on in previous decades, but we never built a movement on the scale of what we're building today, which is a broadly based environmental movement, which if we're concerned about environment and the ecology, then the environment itself is no longer a narrow issue in and of itself. We're talking about changing the very society and world in which we live in if we're going to address the environmental crisis. And so that's on a bigger scale than what we might have anticipated 30 and 40 years ago. Partly because we didn't really change the world fundamentally 30 and 40 years ago. We made great progress, and the awareness that the people of the world today have on issues like war, colonialism, racism, sexism, that's a lot of that's due and thanks to the movements that were built in the past to oppose the war in Vietnam, to fight for women's rights, to fight to desegregate society, First Nations rights, and so on. But the capitalist system proved a lot more powerful and resilient than we might have thought. to the extent where today the globalization of capitalism has really, for the first time in the history of the human race, made it possible for humans to actually destroy the earth. That is, the big, powerful corporations of the world today actually have the capacity for the first time in the history of the capitalist system to actually inflict a very significant, even everlasting damage on the environment. So that's new, and so that raises considerably the stakes in us fighting for a different kind of future where we take the power out of the hands of the corporate elite, take the power out of the hands of the big corporations that control every aspect of our lives, and begin to reorganize society in the interest of the majority. So I'd like to present to you today an overview of the challenge that we face, and some of it I think will be new to you, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we as eco-socialists and as Marxists think are the alternatives that we have to begin to fight for, and then very much look forward to the discussion with you and all of what I'll have to say. And I have to press two buttons as I go here, working with my laptop and the screen behind me. So if I'm out of sync here, please let me know, because I'll try not to talk to the screen as I talk to you. This is our website, the Vancouver Eco-Socialist Group. As Zach said, we're part of the System Change, Not Climate Change network. And what we've tried to do with our website is not just to create another eco-socialist website. We've got lots already, but put a lot of emphasis on what's happening in our part of the world, British Columbia, but also the whole Pacific Northwest, including our fellow citizens of the earth in Alaska, Washington, and Oregon, because we very much face common issues and common struggles. You're aware of the science of climate change, I'm sure, and I won't spend too much time on this. The reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have, told us increasingly that the world's climate is coming under increasing assault due to the rise in greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, which is causing average global temperatures to rise, which is causing tremendously disruptive changes in weather patterns, including causing the kinds of drought that you're going through here in California. That will increasingly cause the oceans to rise and also cause the oceans to acidify as the increased composition of CO2 in the atmosphere creates more and more acidic conditions in the oceans. It's all really serious stuff. This was the fifth report that the IPCC produced last year, and then it just recently produced a report which is an update of the fifth report, and it's looking more specifically at the changes that are happening to the climate in the world. The message continues to be the same, that we have a serious degradation of our natural environment going on with very serious consequences for human society. We need to pay attention to that, and we need to begin to address increasingly radically the changes that are required so we can undo this downward trend that industry has us going on in the world. And the reports just keep coming out that amplify the gravity of the danger. So this was news to most scientists. This study published in National Geographic at the very end of last year, which is that new science of cloud formation and the effects of rising global temperatures on cloud means that we're looking at a more serious scale of the rise of average global temperatures than was thought before. So just another example of how science keeps telling us, keeps warning us that there's something serious going on here and that we have to take seriously. You may have seen this chart, but this is going back almost 500,000 years, showing the correlation between CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and average global temperatures. The chart on the right in blue is the average concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you can see it's always fluctuated around 250 parts per million. Well, the very straight upward line on the right there of the blue is the current readings of CO2 in the atmosphere, which are going off the chart within just a matter of decades since the Industrial Revolution. And a more close-up look of that is from the observatory in Hawaii that is examining the concentrations, and you can see that sharp rise just in the past 50 years. That's pretty scary stuff. We haven't seen 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere for more than 500 million years. So, and this is just in the past 50 years. So, another, serious warning that we have to pay attention to. Now I'm from a country and a part of the continent where the worst of the polluters and the worst of the contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming is taking place, and that is the Alberta tar sands. They're in the neighboring province to ours of Alberta. And this is obviously a very serious concern for people across the continent, the degree of destruction that is being perpetrated in the region of the tar sands. Does everyone approximately know what tar sands are, and why they're so destructive to global warming, to the CO2 concentrations? It's basically a sand tar mix to which you have to apply intense amounts of energy in order to extract the oil from it. So you get the energy by burning more fossil fuels or by hydroelectric dams. There's even a few crazy schemes to build nuclear reactors in the north of Alberta in order to provide the energy required to extract the oil from the sands as they are dug up, or as the energy in the form of heat and chemicals is sent underground to force the oil up to where it can be accessed. So it's a highly energy-intense form of producing crude oil, and it's also highly polluting to water sources because you need vast amounts of water to produce the oil in whatever process is decided to draw it from. And that's the scale of what there is in Alberta, which the fossil fuel companies would like to extract. The Alberta tar sands are the third largest source of fossil fuel reserves in the world. It's massive. And this is a list of top 10 countries in the world. We know that the United States is a major producer of oil in the world, but it's not even on the top 10 list. So that's how vast are some of these other sources, including the Alberta tar sands. I just by chance saw in an email notice today that little box on the right showing the latest estimates of oil reserves in the United States, which are 33 billion barrels. So as I said, that doesn't even make the top 10 list. So what's there in Alberta and what the fossil fuel companies would like to extract is massive. Presently about 2 million barrels a day of oil is extracted from the Alberta tar sands. And the investment plans of the fossil fuel companies in Alberta alone would like to take that up to about 6 million barrels a day, so 3 times what's being produced today. And one of the consequences or the byproducts of the crude refining, that is the initial refining, they call it upgrading of tar sands bitumen, is a product called petroleum coke, which is then used to burn in coal-fired electrical generation stations. So that's a particularly nasty product, which if you go through Detroit now and Chicago, and I'm not sure of the other cities now, you'll see mountains of this stuff sitting as the byproduct of the initial upgrading of tar sands bitumen that takes place. So that's, another added side of the tar sands story of how destructive all this is. Now, another fossil fuel that's on the rise is coal, even though everything about it tells us that we should be cutting it out. But there's big markets for coal in some parts of the world still, including in China. And so there are plans to continue to expand the mining and the export of coal in North America, both in the U.S. and in Canada. Presently, about half of U.S. coal production is there in the middle of the West, Wyoming and Montana. Down at the bottom, you'll see Canada produces about 8% of the amount of coal that the U.S. does. So the U.S. is by far the bigger producer of coal compared to Canada. But U.S. coal that's mined in Wyoming and Montana is a big concern of us in British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, because like the tar sands, it's landlocked. It's got to get to an ocean if it can reach markets, and therefore the capitalists earn the money from doing all of this. And so there has been terrific opposition to the building of new coal export terminals on the coasts of Oregon and Washington. People there have a greater awareness of this than in British Columbia, because in British Columbia we have the first and third, respectively, largest coal exporting ports in North America. Vancouver's first, Prince Rupert is third. We already have U.S. coal from Wyoming and Montana coming into our 2 ports for export, and the plan is to increase the amount of coal that's exported. So this is a concern for us in Canada, even if it's not Canadian coal, and it's a concern across the board in the Pacific Northwest. The very largest proposed coal export terminal in all of North America is for Bellingham, just south of the U.S.-Canada border. It's about halfway in between Vancouver and Seattle. And the coal companies want to build a huge terminal there, but there's terrific opposition to that in Bellingham and the surrounding Whatcom County and in the whole state of Washington. 3 of the 6 proposals by the coal companies to build export terminals in Washington and in Oregon have already been shot down by local opposition, and we can only hope that the other 3 also fail similarly. We have a different challenge in Vancouver and Prince Rupert because we have already established coal export terminals, so it's a lot more difficult we can't shut them down because they're already there. So that's the scale. What we have to do is not just prevent these things from being built, but in our case we have to fight to scale them down, and it's a much more difficult task. It's also more difficult because they're already established to prevent them from expanding because they're already there. Coal-fired electricity is still a major part of U.S. Electrical production. Those are charts showing the different composition of coal into producing electricity. And if the amount or the percentage of electricity generated by coal has dropped a little bit in the United States, it's only because there's increased amounts of natural gas being used for it. And that's almost arguably more polluting than natural gas. So it's, the black figure there in the charts tells you that this country has a major issue in how much of its electricity is generated by climate-damaging fossil fuels. The energy mix in Canada is different. We have some parts of the country that do depend very much on coal, so the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan there that you see on the left of the screen. The red is the proportion of electricity generated by coal, so half of Alberta and Saskatchewan's electricity is generated by coal. Out on the east coast of Canada in Nova Scotia, you see the province there also. But Canada is blessed, you could say, with large amounts of hydroelectric energy, especially Quebec, which gets almost all of its electricity from hydroelectric dams and therefore also is able to sell large quantities to the United States. So we don't have the same scale of challenge with coal or natural gas generation of our electricity. But as the capitalist economy keeps growing and expanding, then the proportions of electricity generated by fossil fuels, for example, the tar sands, will continue to grow. So it's approximately the same challenge. And all that stuff gets exported around the world as well, including to China, where increasingly people are living literally in conditions that don't support human life. That is, there's no air anymore. And this is not an untypical scene in the cities of northern China in the last couple of years. That's a look at the pipelines coming out of the Alberta tar sands region right now, both existing and proposed. So the existing pipeline is the red one that goes south and then jags east. That's the Keystone pipeline that exists already. The dotted red line coming south is the very hotly contested Keystone XL. The blue lines there are also existing tar sands pipelines, although each of those, there's proposals to expand them, just as Keystone is to be, they want to expand it in the form of Keystone XL. Those blue lines are also being proposed for expansion. And then the 2 that you see on the left going to the British Columbia coast, the orange and the purple colored ones, are again 2 proposed tar sands pipelines. One of them you may have heard of, Northern Gateway, which runs to northern British Columbia, is very hotly contested by all of the First Nations people that live across the north of British Columbia and Alberta. And this is the other one. This is an existing crude oil pipeline that comes into Vancouver but carries largely crude oil from Alberta. And so Kinder Morgan Company wants to triple the quantity of crude oil coming through this pipeline by building a new parallel line, and this would carry exclusively tar sands bitumen to the port of Vancouver. And also there's a jag there south into northern Washington state, although that would not carry bitumen, at least for now, because that would require the same kind of approval process that we know Keystone XL is having great difficulty with. So for now, that's a proposal to expand tar sands bitumen export through Vancouver. And and so one of the aspects of this, which makes the whole thing very hotly contested, is just how dangerous it is to be shipping oil, leave alone tar sands bitumen, through these kinds of ocean waters. That red line there is the route that ocean tankers have to take to get out to the open ocean, and including going to the refineries that are just south of the border you see there in Washington State. And this is not even showing the tanker routes that are going down into Puget Sound, because there are oil refineries at the head of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. So these are very dangerous waters to be running oil tankers, to say the least. This, for example, is the route that the tankers would have to take if the Northern Gateway pipeline were to be approved. And this is one of the main reasons why that proposal is so hotly contested. Because look at the kind of waters that you would be taking, the largest oil tankers in the world through. It's absolute madness. And as I said, is one of the reasons why this whole thing is so hotly contested. A spill of a tanker in these kind of waters is just, the consequences for the aquatic life and for human habitation there is, it's beyond thinking about. So back again to these proposals then. So that's the orange line there is the proposed Northern Gateway to Kitimat. The purple line down to Vancouver, Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain. And then these blue lines that are going to, you can see the tip of Lake Superior and then onwards towards the east, I'll talk about for a moment. That's as big an expansion proposal by tar sands as what we're facing on the coast of British Columbia, and also what Keystone XL proposes to do. It's not as widely known or as hotly contested, because these are proposals, the blue line is proposals to expand 2 existing pipelines. And so there's loopholes that maybe the pipeline companies can get through when it's an existing pipeline as opposed to proposing an entirely new one. And so there's now increasing concern about what will happen to the Great Lakes region with all of these proposed expand pipelines, because the Great Lakes, the 5 of them they have about 95% of the freshwater surface supply in North America. So getting an oil spill in and around any of these would have very serious consequences. And so, for example, this red line that runs through southern Ontario is another of the proposed expansions by the tar sands industry. This is an existing oil pipeline which runs from east to west, that is to the refineries in Sarnia, which is Canada's biggest oil refining center. So this is a 40, 50-year-old pipeline that begins in Portland, Maine.
It's the wrong image, I think.
Thank you. So yeah, the red line is the existing Enbridge pipeline. And so this is an existing pipeline that begins in Portland, Maine, bringing crude from abroad and then offloading it in Portland and taking up to the refineries in Montreal and onward into refineries in Ontario. So Enbridge Company wants to reverse the flow of that and supply that pipeline with its existing network, which is the purple line there in Michigan State coming from Alberta, and then be shipping product east now to Montreal and potentially on to Portland. And so all of a sudden tar sands bitumen will arrive not only in Ontario and in Montreal, but also in Maine through the existing pipeline if their proposal goes through. And just to complete the pipeline story, it's unbelievable when you think of the scale, but this is the first all Canada pipeline that would carry Alberta crude oil to eastern Canada, through Canada. There is no pipeline presently in Canada that carries the crude from Alberta east. And again, this would be another of the tar sands pipeline proposals. So I think I've counted 6 so far. Northern Gateway, Trans Mountain, this one, Energy East, and the Keystone XL makes number 4, and then the 2 that would come from Alberta down to the tip of Lake Superior in Minnesota, and then carry on through the existing pipeline network. So massive, massive expansion of the export and transport of tar sands bitumen from Alberta that's proposed here. Natural gas is another fossil fuel industry where there's massive expansion going on, and I think you're familiar with that here, where it would take the form of expanding the fracking for natural gas. So these are the fields in North America that contain either oil or gas in fracked form. And by the way, I just found an interesting chart comparing the volumes of natural gas, the estimated reserves of 3 countries there on the bottom left hand, Russia, the US, and Canada. You can see Russia's reserves are massive, massive. So kind of interesting to think that today they're talking about replacing the natural gas that supplies Europe from Russia in light of the events in the Ukraine. I can't see how they could do that. Among other things, it'd be extremely expensive. But so you can see, nonetheless, a pretty extensive reserves of natural gas in the United States. Of course, there's massive fracking going on in eastern United States, in Pennsylvania, Texas, and other areas that are proposed, also in North Dakota. The Bakken oil field there, which also has natural gas, is it's actually the second largest oil field in the United States. So there's massive plans to expand natural gas drilling, fracking, and transport. This is the map of natural gas for Canada, and we're very much affected by this in British Columbia, because in the northeast of the province, and I'll point that out here, this is where there's proposals to massively expand the already existing drilling and fracking of natural gas. So we come into this situation and picture very much. That's more of a close-up. All of these lines here, colored lines, are the proposals for natural gas pipelines going to the coast, where liquefied natural gas plants would be built. And there's proposals for 4, 5, 6, 7, take your pick. Of those colored lines there, the black one that you see there is the proposed Northern Gateway tar sands pipeline to Kitimat. All the other lines you see there are proposals to build natural gas pipelines fed by fracking in the northeast. And I found a very interesting time-lapse chart here. Among the strongest opponents of fracking in the northeast of BC are, of course, the First Nations people who live there. This is the territory of the Blueberry River First Nation in northeast British Columbia. And this is a photo or an image from 1954 of the existing oil or gas drilling going on there. It's almost non-existent. And they have a YouTube video that's, if you go to the link that I have there on the screen, shows you in a time-lapse way the cumulative effects of the expansion of oil, gas, hydroelectric dams, transmission lines, pipelines, and so on. And so I'll save you the time lapse, but here's the final product. Looks like this. And so this is at the outset of the vast expansion of fracking. So it's just massive what the change in the landscape that is being proposed. And the people who live in this region, the First Nations people especially, it's in the red square if you look on the smaller map, are fiercely opposed to this expansion of natural gas. But this is a real tough political struggle for us, because the BC government and the Canadian government are selling the argument that this expansion of natural gas in the northeast of British Columbia and also in other parts of Canada is sort of our way of the future. We're all going to be well off, and we're going to be able to pay for all our social programs and everything else with this kind of expansion. And then we come to oil by rail, which has been undergoing a massive expansion of its own in the past just 3 or 4 years, and it's fueled by 3 big factors. One is that almost all of these fossil fuels, the liquid or fossil fuels that we're talking about, are landlocked. So they got to move to get either to the existing refinery network in the continent, or if they're destined for export, they have to get to the coast. So railways are one way of doing that potentially. We know all the pipeline proposals face stiff opposition for all the right reasons. So that's another reason why the oil companies are turning to rail. And then the third thing is that the regulations governing railways are much more lax than is the case with pipelines. Not a surprise if you think of how the role that the railways played initially in the conquest of the continent over the First Nations people that were here already, and then the establishment of the Industrial Revolution. So all of this has made it easier for the railways to surge ahead, basically with very little examination of what they're doing, leave alone approval process. And of course, one of the consequences of this, quite early on in the process, was the disaster in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, last year, July 6th, 2013, an oil train disaster in Lac-Mégantic. X marks the spot there. And this oil train was going along the former CP rail line. It's a historic line that was built more than 100 years ago that connected Montreal to St. John and other parts of eastern Canada. So this was built in the 1880s by CP Rail. By the 1980s, CP Rail no longer wanted to have the rail line. And by the way, the line goes directly through Maine, so the people of Maine, of course, are very much affected by all this too. CP Rail didn't want the line anymore in the 1980s. It wasn't a big moneymaker for them. They had allowed the condition of the track to deteriorate. So they did finally succeed in selling it off in the 1990s, and then that rail line went through a couple of owners of what they call short line railways, which typically cut to the bone the expenditure on maintenance. And so a company that had bought that line in 2003 became the partner in this plan, which was to ship oil from North Dakota all the way to St. John, which happens to have Canada's largest oil refinery and also a very large oil export terminal. And so the owners of Irving Oil, who always got their oil from abroad by tanker, these changing economics of oil in the world made it possible for them to consider buying their crude oil from North Dakota. Then they had to get it there. So then they went and met with the railways and said, how can we do this? So a business consortium arose and then began to move the oil only in 2012. So roughly a year after this whole thing began, the disaster at Lac-Mégantic happened. And so a train was left poorly attended overnight, rolled into town at about midnight, and a huge fireball erupted. Most of the people who died in Lac-Mégantic were in the town's sort of most popular bar restaurant location, which happened to be sitting right beside the railway, and nobody knew what was coming, of course. And so a terrible, unbelievable disaster took place in which 47 people lost their lives. By the way, there's been no public inquiry of how all these circumstances that came together to produce the disaster and who was responsible, which is, I think, a sad commentary. That's the day after the center of the town was destroyed, and vast quantities of the oil that was in the trains burned, but a lot of it went into the local waterway as well. A total disaster from beginning to end, with unbelievable human consequences for the people of that town. But this was by no means the only oil train disaster that's happened since the beginning of all this. It just happened to be the one that happened in the center of a town, but lots of others have taken place, and luckily didn't happen in town sites. But this was Alabama, also carrying oil from the Bakken field in North Dakota. Then this was Castleton, North Dakota, just at the very end of last year, December 30th. Then shortly after, I think this was January 8th of this year, another crash. This was in northern New Brunswick. These are all carrying the oil from North Dakota. And these were two derailments that happened in Calgary. Luckily didn't result in a disaster. That's the Bow River, which runs through the center of Calgary. And there were two oil train derailments in Calgary in June of last year. This one here, which basically the weight of these oil cars, these bridges, this railway infrastructure wasn't built to carry the weight of these heavy oil cars. So in this case, the bridge just simply collapsed. And here in a neighborhood in Calgary, again, this was going at a slow speed, so luckily there was no oil spilled or no explosion, but the trains went off the track. And look how close they are to a local neighborhood. In fact, both of these accidents in Calgary are within a stone's throw of the center of the city, because that's how our cities were built. They were built first with the railways, and then the city builds around them. So anytime you have oil moving through the center of a city like this, it's pretty dangerous stuff. And these oil trains are going through virtually every major city in the continent. The Lac-Mégantic oil train went through Twin Cities, Chicago, somewhere near Detroit, Toronto for sure, Montreal for sure. So this is an exceptionally dangerous industry that's on the loose and growing vastly. This is another oil train plan. I have to show you the map just so you won't be familiar with the geography, but look at the province of Manitoba there. It's on the border of Hudson's Bay. And so there's a proposal by Omnitrax, which is a Denver-based short line operator, to run oil trains over this line, which is a former CN rail line that Omnitrax bought about 20 years ago. It's used to ship grain because that's a convenient port in Churchill. It's ice-free for a good part of the year, so it's a convenient port for shipping grain. Now Omnitrax has a formal proposal to run oil trains up there across, much of what is basically bog and muskeg. So, crazy scheme. What's been overlooked in Lac Megantic, I mentioned that there's been no formal public inquiry into the disaster. I mean, imagine 47 people killed and there's no, there's going to be, there's lawsuits and there'll be financial compensation to the victims, but, was this a criminal act or not, or just a fate of nature? Well, I think it was very much a criminal act. I think I can think of at least 4 categories. The dilapidated line that was chosen to move this oil across, the fact that the volatility of North Dakota oil was known and yet wasn't accounted for, and the people of Lac Megantic or these major cities that I talked to you about certainly weren't aware it was that dangerous. Still today, notification is not given to communities. Hey, we're going to have X number of oil trains rolling through your community over the next week, month, year, whatever the case may be, just so you know. Especially if you happen to live alongside. No, that's not done. And it so happened that this particular line that I showed you, connecting Montreal to St. John, Transport Canada had approved operating those trains with just one operator. And that was a major factor in Lac Megantic because the fellow, the reason the accident happened was the train was parked overnight while the operator slept. Well, there's a procedure for him to lock down the train so it doesn't roll away as this one did. Well, the inquiry hasn't determined ultimately exactly what happened, but either he failed to lock down the train, which could be understandable, he's at the end of an 8 or 10 hour day and there's no one else to help him, or there was no surveillance of the train at any point during the evening. As it happened, a small fire broke out in the locomotive. After the operator had locked down the train, gone to bed for the night in a local motel, the firefighters arrived. It seems that they shut the locomotive off because an actual fire had broken out in the locomotive, and therefore that caused the air pressure on the brakes to disconnect. And maybe the operator didn't manually lock down each of those oil cars, because there's a procedure. You have to lock down, I think it's 1 of 5, if you can leave the train parked stationary. You turn that big wheel. Imagine the guy after an 8-hour shift, he's going to go out now. So the whole thing is crazy, but approved by Transport Canada to run this with one operator. Now, here in the United States, there's something very interesting going on, which is that the U.S. Transport Authority here, Department of Transport, and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration necessarily wants to know what's going on with North Dakota oil. So the oil companies in North Dakota are resisting providing the data to the Department of Transportation here in the U.S., just as in Canada, as to exactly what they know about the oil is that they're bringing up out of the ground, how volatile is it, and therefore what are the consequences for shipping this stuff by rail. There's a big battle that's taking place over this. And I mentioned already that the railway companies don't want to inform communities of what they're bringing through communities, whether it's dangerous oil, whether it's liquefied, whether it's propane, which is liquefied natural gas, and so on. So, I mean, these railway companies consider themselves to be above the law. And it's, quite aside from the climate consequences of unleashing oil by rail across the continent, there's just basic safety measures even that are not being followed. And just the last part of the fossil fuel picture I want to tell you about, which surprised me to read about it. I thought I'd seen and read the worst. But something like, there's 3 trillion tons of known reserves of coal in the world that can be obtained by traditional methods, either digging mining shafts underground or mountaintop removal. It turns out there's far more coal that's much deeper underground, and they've come up with a brilliant way of getting access to the energy stored there if we let them get away with this, which is to burn the stuff underground and capture the gases as it comes up. So this is a very informative article that appeared in New Scientist, which is the last piece of news that we wanted to have. But here we go. Here's another worse than everything else I've talked about way in which the fossil fuel companies could exploit fossil fuel reserves. And there are actually pilot projects of this underground coal gasification that are going on. So this is really, it's an industry and it's a whole situation that's out of control. So what's wrong with our political leaders and the industries that they represent that allows this to go on and seemingly, apart from citizen opposition, this thing doesn't get the opposition that it deserves? there's something going on here which is more than just greed or even outright craziness, although I think those are very big factors in what's going on. But there's something in our economic system that's driving this, because this is not normal conduct on the part of normally thinking human beings. And our view on this as eco-socialists is that we have an imperative in the capitalist economic system that is just built in towards expansion. And yeah, it's all about greed, and it's all about the money that's made for profit making, but it's also how the system works. Capitalism is about reaping profit and money for shareholders. It's about competing against your competitors and out-competing them. And the way you do that is you just continually expand. Capitalism doesn't know how to put the brakes on. It's just not in its very nature and functioning. And so that's the challenge that we face in trying to put some control over our climate future. We have an out-of-control economic system where no one is at the lever. And anyone who tries to put their hand on the lever to slow it down is pushed out of the way through force, through violence, through bribery, through all the ways that we've learned how the 1% operate in this world. So that's the fundamental challenge that we face as humans on this earth today, is an entire economic system dominating the world that's out of control and that doesn't know anything except expansion and greed. So even if we were to bring about improvements in how we generate our energy supply through renewable energies, the 26% there, these are average global figures. They'll vary from one country to another. But even if we were able to bring our energy supply into some kind of renewable form, which by the way is impossible when it's continually expanding, but even if we could, well, what are we going to do about the clear cutting of forests that's going on, which contributes 17% of greenhouse gas emissions? What about our chemicalized and industrialized agriculture? What are we going to do about that? What about our transportation, run largely on fossil fuels? Air travel, how our cities are built to get around by, in 80 or 90% of the cases, by automobiles, and the shipping that ships stuff all over the world so it can be bought and sold. What are we going to do about all? What about industry, manufacturing, all those things that we think are necessary to modern life? So I think if we look at that, even if we bought into the mistaken idea that there is such a thing as renewable energy on the scale in which we're consuming it, because that's a myth. I mean, if you go out and build all the solar panels in the world to replace what we're generating with fossil fuels today, well, there's nothing renewable or green about that. But even if you see the systemic nature of the problem that we're facing. And so what we need to confront this, and this is the view that eco-socialists, and we're not alone in this, bring to the climate movement, is we have to tackle the corporate control over our economic life, because this is what is driving us to all this destructive behavior. We've got to put an end to war and militarism. This is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and we need to institute an economic system of rational planning. We decide as a society through democratic forms of governance what it is exactly we're going to do as a society. And we're going to change the priorities that we place on things radically. We're going to put a great deal more emphasis and a great deal more value on our agricultural production. We're not going to leave that to underpaid foreign workers to grow our food. We're going to learn to do it ourselves, and we're going to be better off for it. We're going to elevate the place of science and of culture, health and education, the planning of our cities. It's all got to come under a rational and democratic decision-making process, and then we decide what we're going to do. Right now, it's completely out of our control. We have virtually no say on any of this stuff, and oil by rail is just another reminder of how out of control things are for us. And these are, I'll just throw out a few ideas for discussion here about how we have to get there. I think we have to begin by opposing the destructive projects as they come along, the pipelines, the oil by rail, the fracking, all of these. We should oppose them right out. That's the beginning of wisdom, shall we say. And then we have to begin now to fight for the kinds of changes that can begin to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels and our excessive consumption across the board. And I want to stress here that when we fight for these things, we have to have a strategy where we want to challenge the corporate control over our society today. So when we fight for public transit, we're not just fighting for better public transit. We want to end the control of the auto industry on how our cities are designed and planned, and how our entire countries are planned. When we fight for local food production, we're only going to get that if we break the control that the agricultural, chemical, industrial complex has over agriculture. Because whatever little inroads and niches we might make in local food production are going to be vastly outweighed by the competitive pricing pressure coming from big agro industry and so on. So take all of the issues that we can begin to fight today on. We have to have that perspective at one and the same time, that we're fighting to bring in sort of popular democratic control into how our society and how our economy is organized. And I think ultimately what we need to build political movements that challenge for political and governmental power, because we can't tackle this problem piecemeal. We need governments with all of their resources and mechanisms at our disposal that begin to make the overall and overreaching decisions that we need to refashion society. Because otherwise we're just always fighting rearguard actions against this bad proposal coming from the oil companies, or this thing that the petrochemical agricultural complex is doing. We need to get out of the strictly defensive mode and also move forward and challenge for political power and control of society. I'll just show, and with just a couple of slides that show, I think, why we can take a lot of encouragement despite all the difficult news of what we face, because people are waking up to this assault on our environment that is taking place. These are people in Calgary who began to speak out against the trains that were running through the center of their city last year and beginning to derail. This is the very, I think, well-known protest that took place in northern New Brunswick against gas fracking, which was quite successful. The company that was doing the exploratory work for gas fracking was forced to shut down operations, and we'll see if they try and make another comeback next year. But this was quite a successful movement that united the people of New Brunswick. New Brunswick's a very multinational place, and so this brought together people of English and French language background, plus of course the Mi'kmaq First Nations people. And they fought hard, and they fought, it was a difficult fight because the government threw the police at them, and there were people arrested and a lot of violence coming from the police against the protest movement, but they stood their ground, sometimes a little bit radically even, and a lot of people took inspiration from this across the continent. Not necessarily with a car burning, I don't necessarily propose that here, but creating that broadly based community movement that could say no. This was a protest in Vancouver, my city, against the expansion of coal exports, and I put this in because I love the placard that someone brought to that. That's one of my favorite all-time protest placards that I've ever seen. And of course, you had very important protests here in the United States against the Keystone XL pipeline and this whole fossil fuel industry juggernaut. So this was the most recent one last month, but there have been others. This was last year, and then even a couple of years ago. So I take a lot of inspiration from this, and we should, including the renaissance of the First Nations movement, the Aboriginal peoples movement from across North America, which is, today very much front and center in politics in Canada, the opposition of the First Nations people to this corporate assault on our rights and on our environment. And it's something that gives us a great deal of inspiration, the Idle No More movement, which of course you probably heard about. This was, one of several large protest actions that's taken place in British Columbia in the past year and a half. And of course, you may have heard of Neil Young's recent music tour in January of this year. He's speaking out quite forcefully now in support of First Nations rights and inspiring a lot of people in doing so. So I'll leave that there because I've probably spoken longer than I should have. And I have a few slides here of suggested articles and books you could read. I'll just click through those as we talk, but for now I'll end my talk here, and I look very much forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.